All right. Welcome back, everyone. So we are on air again after a short break to stretch the legs and arms. Um, let's see some statistics. Yeah, I see that you joining the room. That's good. Welcome back. Hope you've had a nice time during the break. And now we are ready to continue our first day of Global Project Management Days online conference. And our next guest consults international and local companies from numerous industries. And he do it on the topic of project and program management, on the topic of change management, process management, and business analysis. Maybe you know his book, Happy Projects. This was a shining star for, I guess, more than 17 years until the moment in 2017 when he published a new one called Project Program Change. And he made his contribution to academic activities of universities and professional organizations, but especially I want to mention that he was awarded with IPMA Research Achievement Award in 2014. So today we want to talk about courage during the crisis and what role does it play to resolve crisis effectively. So please welcome on our online stage directly from Austria, Roland Gareis. Dear Roland, please, the stage is yours. We're looking forward to your keynote.
Okay, Vladimir, thank you very much for these friendly words. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you all virtually. Given the time we all live in, which is very challenging and a little bit sad for many of us, of course, it's more than appropriate to talk about crises. But crises, are not such an easy thing. They are not too popular. People that define crisis very often are not welcome in organization. There's not enough courage actually to explicitly define challenging situations as crisis, but people are very careful. So I think, I would like to clarify a few things here, identify and present a couple of models regarding crisis management to you and show you how we deal with crisis, how we resolve crisis in a real situation on a case study from my own company. I will do the presentation based on the PowerPoint slides, and let me just, or allow me to upload those. And as you can see, courage in crisis, this is what I just addressed. And the basic message is you need first to explicitly define the crisis in order to be capable to resolve the crisis successfully. Because if you don't explain to the people that you are in a crisis situation as a company, as a project, they don't understand, they won't understand why you need to perform unpopular measures, why they have to change their behavior whatsoever, right? So you need to work with the people, with the stakeholders, and therefore you need to communicate the situation to them so they have a chance to accept what you're actually doing. Vladimir presented my company already, and I don't want to add anything to this, but that since 30 years, actually a little bit longer, since 1983, we do annually a management conference in Vienna, which is called the Happy Projects Conference. It's a conference with some 300 participants, and it's national and international audience, and for us a main event in order to present some innovation as far as our concepts and models and so on are concerned, and share and learn from others that are active in this community. So this is us. It's important for you to understand we are a small consulting company. We are Austrian based, but we operate internationally. But some 70% of our volume is in Austria, of course, and in Germany, I would say. So we are small. some 15 employees, some freelancers that work with us in project situations and so on. So last year, and that's interesting, we had our very best business year ever, revenue-wise, relationships with our customers, contribution of margin that we made, and so on. So we were very, very happy. But look what the actual situation is. Given the fact that the trainings are postponed, many companies don't want to meet, everybody's working home office, online is not always possible or wanted for certain situations. Also, many consulting projects were interrupted or canceled as such. So basically what we expect for this year is a drop in revenue for at least 40%. So we have some short working situations with some of our employees, and Corona is quite a challenge for us. We are small, we don't have any credits in our company as such, so for sure we will survive. But we need to change, we need to further develop our products, we need to adapt as far as our competencies are concerned in consultancy, in training, we need to apply new technologies. So, of course, we defined our situation as a crisis and openly we communicate this to the rest of the world so they understand why we behave in certain situations in certain ways. On top of this, as you can see, and I will go into this story a little later on, we defined also a crisis for our project, Happy Projects 20 organizing. Because, as I said, it's not feasible anymore to do it as an in-house type of physical attendance conference anymore. And we had to decide to do it also as an online conference. And we wanted actually to do it in May, 7th of May, and we had already to postpone it to September for certain reasons and so on. So what you see is there's a project crisis in our situation and we learn a lot and we want to be as authentic as any possible. And there's a company crisis. And of course, these situations relate to each other. And this is also a challenge and offers also chances, which is interesting and important to say. I guess I said a couple of things as far as these topics here are concerned. That you need courage to define a crisis, that a crisis management culture is required. You don't want to run into a crisis situation without knowing what you should be doing and what kind of approaches would be appropriate, which processes need to be applied. As far as processes are concerned, this is important in terms of understanding crisis management. We need to differentiate between avoiding a crisis. Okay, you avoid crisis before the crisis actually occurs. Okay, so you think in scenarios, what can happen, which kind of measures are possible in order to avoid, or you assume that a certain crisis might occur in your company, in your project, but then you provide for this with alternative plans, with escalation models, whatsoever. And the third part is you can actually have to resolve a crisis, and this is what I would like to focus on, okay? To define a crisis is the strongest management intervention that you have. So you need to be very careful. You need to be very responsible when you define something a crisis. And you need to have certain criteria and standards on what you consider as a crisis and what you don't. Because if you say, now we are in a crisis situation, it allows you to radical changes, which of course you would not be allowed to implement otherwise. So I mentioned before, you need to explain that and to communicate it to the stakeholders. How do you do project crisis management, but also company crisis management? Usually you don't define this as a project itself to resolve the crisis. That would be too much, a project in a project, okay? A project to resolve a project crisis. That's too much, that's building up too much complexity. But what you would like to do is you would like to perform the crisis resolution in an iterative and agile approach. Okay, here's more or less the structure. As I said before, a couple of definitions and models, and then I want to show you the whole history of our projects, Happy Project 20 organizing, and a little bit of background, and then I would like to explain how we defined the crisis, how we analyzed and planned as a first iteration, and how we implemented several iterations in order to resolve the crisis. What is a crisis? A crisis is a period of instability in a company, in a project. It's characterized by the ambivalence of its outcome. That's important. Like when you're talking about a medical crisis of a person, okay? When you say, okay, this is a critical situation, it means this person can survive or he or she can die. So it's the ambivalence, okay? That's important. So it's not just a little conflict or a little problem. You don't have the danger of that your project is dying, okay? If you have a problem or conflict. A crisis is something serious, so you need to be careful how to use this term and this approach. It's limited in time. There's no never-ending crisis situation, okay? So you need to be clear, what do you want to achieve in the resolution process? When is it over? And then you go back to normal, next normal, okay? And what's so important, because people are saying, well, we have a crisis or we don't know what to do or whatsoever, it's a social construct, it's a social construction, which means you need to agree within your organization that this situation is a crisis and requires crisis resolution. Well, what could you do in order to find criteria? Well, basically, a criteria for defining a project crisis is that you have a fundamental change, for example, in the objectives of the project, okay? You don't only have to provide certain features of a product, but many other features are required. You're not capable of doing this whatsoever. Or the business case objectives are changing, okay? You thought, let me stick with this explanation of or example of product development. You have a business case for your product for the next 3, 4, 5 years of selling this product, but all of a sudden your competitors are faster, are better, come up with a better product than the ones that you are developing. So all of a sudden you have a real challenge in the business case, and this might lead to interrupt or redesign, of course, your project. Or the context might be changing, like the coronavirus situation, where all of a sudden we have restrictions from our government and we could not, for example, organize any events with more than 100 people anymore. And this didn't allow us to perform a project in the original design anymore. Of course, you could quantify this to a certain extent, and you could say, okay, in our case, if we have an external project where we work with our clients and customers, if our project costs are exceeded by, I don't know, 50% or whatsoever, then this is a crisis situation. But it depends, okay? And it varies depending on the project type, but you need a few criteria in order to be clear what you consider a crisis and what you don't. And basically, as I say, it's a social construct, which means those involved need to agree on the fact that you have a crisis. And if there is this agreement based on the common communication structure, which is power determined, I, as the manager of the company, I have more power to define this than my secretary, of course. Then you define the crisis and then you make the difference, okay? Crisis is the difference that makes a difference. Difference is that you do crisis management. When we focus on the resolution, resolving a project crisis, as I said before, you don't start with resolving right away, but you need to pull the emergency pull here, and which means is you need first to define the crisis. So you need to analyze a little bit. Is it worthwhile to define a crisis? Why are we in this situation? What happened? What do we have to do? What is our common strategy? So before you start with the resolution itself, you need to define that. Well, and of course, you're in the middle of a project. And let me focus on project management, of course. What you should have done if you do professional project management, you should have done some project risk management. And in risk management, when several risks come together, this could be in a scenario, one of the crisis situations. So you might have provided for a crisis situation, one or the other situation. In our Corona context, of course, nobody prepared for this whatsoever. So let me go briefly into these two processes. First, defining the project crisis. The idea is that you haven't, the crisis defined yet. Okay, so you need to analyze, you need to create a basis for the decision to define the crisis. And maybe you say, well, yeah, this and this is a problem, but still we don't want to define it a crisis. We can handle it differently. So you need to create the basis for decision making. Crisis, yes or not? And if yes, you need to decide about a crisis resolution strategy, and which strategies there are, I will come to in a moment. The tasks, you need to analyze the reasons, you need to analyze the project situation with a strong context orientation. As I said before, you need to look at the stakeholder relationships. You need to look at the business case, of course. Okay, it's not enough just to look if you can meet the objectives of the project. You can still be on time, but you have a product which nobody wants to buy in the future. Okay, so context is the message here. Yeah, and then finally decide about the crisis and the strategy, and then you need to assign to a project crisis organization to say, hey, you are now responsible to resolve the project, not to perform the project anymore, but to resolve the project crisis, to put it back on track, to redesign it so it can be successful. So you move from the definition process into the resolving process. Resolving a project crisis. Look at the bottom line first. It says you need to analyze the situation and you need to plan what you do, and you need to do some ad hoc measures in order to reduce any damages that can happen and so on. Then you go into an iterative cycle in terms of resolving. So as I said, you might have 1 week or 2 week sprints or iterations in order to define which actions, which user stories are required. You perform those, then you see where you stand. You need to define new user stories, and you go on like that. And you don't stop after the resolutions, but you have to stabilize your project again. So you need to plan how will the next normal in your project look like, so you can end the project crisis and communicate this appropriately, and then you, you can go on with performing the next normal. And again, next normal, it's not the new normal, but you definitely need to adapt several times again. So defining first, resolving afterwards. Which strategies do we have? Let me open this all together. When you see the ambivalence, okay, of the outcome by redesigning the project, redefining the duration, the cost, the partners, the stakeholders, redefining the objectives, reassigning new project roles, whatsoever. You need to redesign in order to be successful. So you continue with your project work, but you do it very, very differently. You change it dramatically. This is crisis management. Or you can interrupt, okay, another resolution strategy, or you can stop, okay? But still, stopping doesn't mean that you stop right now and nothing is done anymore, but you need to secure some of your outcomes, some of your minimal viable products. You need to give feedback to the people. You need to assign the people to other jobs, to other projects, whatsoever. So there's also work to be done. So these are the basic strategies that you have in a project. And then you, when we decide, for example, to do the redesign, and this is what our example will be about, then, as I said before, you run into a first process here of analyzing and planning. I don't want to go through that, and this is just in German here, but what you see is you need to manage the crisis itself. So the crisis resolution needs to be started, it needs to be controlled, and so on. You need to do some communication, you analyze the situation, you define the user stories, and then you implement the user stories and the activities, which are the ad hoc activities that are possible at this point in time. And then you move on to the resolution iterations. I just want to show you this iterative approach of crisis management, because things are, you don't have all the information that you need in a crisis situation. You learn continuously, and this means you redefine your user stories, you reprioritize your user stories, and you implement in iterations, in sprints, which are very short term, and you control very tough and tightly during this process. So what do we need? What's the relationship to project management in crisis management? Well, we want to be iterative and as agile as possible. We need, of course, to manage the resolution of the crisis itself. So we need to start the resolution, we need to control it, we need to close it. So hopefully sometime it's over. And the crisis resolution itself is not a project. So there's no project in the project. So let me come to the case study. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Well, I guess I need to speed up a bit. What's important and what you can see here is, this is our Happy Projects conference. Okay, this is last year. You see we have some 300 people here in the plenary, and there are many parallel tracks and so on. So yeah, nice international event. You see here, we organized this always as a project. Here's the work breakdown structure. Of course, this was at the beginning in March. The conference was scheduled for the 7th of May. So you can see many of the work packages are crossed out, which means they are completed. So we were pretty far advanced and everything was fine. Yeah, according to plans, the design was final. The speakers were agreed with. We had some 180 participants registered already at this point in time, and so on. Yeah, we had, of course, a project organization. And what you can read here is that I am, and I am the project owner of this project. Gareis is the project manager. We have here a project team and some external partners and so on. What happened in March was the announcement of the Corona crisis, and we became nervous right away, and we were thinking a little bit in scenarios. And but we didn't make any decisions. But on March 10th, and you see this was very, very short term, there was a restriction, no indoor events with more than 100 people. So on March 10th, we made the decision to postpone the conference to autumn 2020 because everything will be easy and in order by then. That was the assumption. So at this point in time, beginning of March, we did not define a crisis. So I just wanted to show you this. You don't jump in the crisis right away. Be careful with this, okay? Because we only had to postpone the date. We didn't have to change the overall objectives, not the project organization, not the overall structures and stakeholder relationships. It was just, under quotes, postponing of the date. And we, my son and myself, we are the managing directors of RGC. We made this decision, and the whole thing took 1 week, and it was easy. And of course, a number of activities were required. Okay, and we had to plan, of course, the further project performance. But then the 14th of April came, and we had to define a project crisis. Because what happened? We learned that Corona health crisis is long-lasting. It's not over within a couple of weeks or a month. So no chance in September to run the physical attending conference in Austria. Many cancellations internationally. Vladimir, we talked about this briefly before, that also the IPMA conference now in St. Petersburg was canceled, and so on. So we learned that. We were very closely observing this all the time. There were first offers of online conferences. Tools came on the market, like the one that we are using today. We made some first experiences with online work and so on. So these were a few reasons. We checked our portfolio. And we said, you see, we are a small company. So we had some, as you can see here, 4 ongoing projects. The rest is, of course, ongoing business. And the Happy Projects Conference, we say the status situation is very serious. We're in a bad shape because we don't know what will happen in the future. So we had to redesign. That was the overall resolution strategy. And what was important, and this is what I addressed in the beginning, that for us, the Happy Project Conference is very important as an identity dimension of our company. So people come to us because they are expecting innovations in management and so on. They want to meet. There is a meeting point in the community and so on. The event itself is a strong marketing instrument, so it's very important for the organization, for the company itself. It's easy to consume, of course, and we can always present our innovations. So we defined a project crisis with the following objectives: resolve it, recreate the conference itself, redesign the project, do the whole thing efficiently in the context of the Corona crisis. And we made a schedule from April 14th, and we wanted to have it resolved until the May 31st. So 1.5 months, tough time, believe me. Then we did some analysis and planning, and for this we established a project crisis organization. So what you see, what's interesting, what we expect and what we recommend is that the project owner might become the project crisis manager. So we see the project owner with much more operative management responsibility in a crisis situation than before. And the manager needs to report, of course, to a crisis owner. In our case, this is the overall RGC management. Of course, we use a pool of internal and external experts. They work in different action teams. And as we work in this agile format, we also have a product owner. You see here a backlog, and you see, of course, there are ongoing activities. There's resolving the crisis, and there's stabilizing, and we defined a number of user stories and some measures that go with this, and so on. We adapted the stakeholder analysis, so new stakeholders come into play all of a sudden, the prototyping organization, the tool provider, and so on. We developed the communication plan. As you can see, one for the 2 weeks in April, one for the months of May, with different stakeholders, with different media, with different content to communicate. Yes, I come to the end of my presentation, organizing. So then organizing now the iterations of resolving. Here are a number of user stories that we have. And one of the most important was we had on the 26th of May, a prototype event where we used for the very first time this new technical solution, this tool, conference tool. We worked with a studio in our office, and now we are analyzing the learnings from this. And this is the basis now for having made the decision that we do now the Happy Project Conference in a different format. Emotions are important. You see, I'm, for example, the project sponsor here in blue. Look at me. Did I have a lot of joy or gratitude or interest or hope? Nothing. Okay, I was very depressed and no good at all. Our team members, they didn't see it so tough as I did. But when you look here, for example, in May, given that we had some good results already, the emotional situation was also changing. So we are observing this and make sure that we work with the emotions, we communicate appropriately, we involve the people and the stakeholders in an appropriate form. So what are the results of resolving the project crisis here? We have a new design, a new tool, new technical details, agreements with the suppliers, and so on. We had this prototype event. We call it Breaking Patterns event. And we used, as I just show you here, our own situation as a case study for this. So what happened to the Happy Projects 20? Look at this, the black birds we hadn't in our logo from the very beginning. So now all of a sudden it's online and live. It's about mindset. That was the original idea and it's still valid because the question is, which kind of mindset do you need for crisis situations? Which kind of mindset is required for the next normal? So now it's about mindset and crises and next normal, okay? And we invite, of course, our people, and we start in the coming week now with the marketing of this new designed event. And we are very positive that we will be or we can be successful with this. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that there are some reactions and there's still a little bit of chatting possible. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you for sharing this real life example, this story, so we can feel how all these mechanics work. I'll pass some questions to you. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
All right.
I think that the main area is the following. It takes time to identify crisis. It's obvious. Who should be the first to take that leading role to identify crisis? Is it a project manager who should find and escalate, or project sponsor, or someone else?
Very valid question. Basically, what we would say is that the project manager can address the project sponsor and say, hey, these are the problems, this is what we're observing, this is our problem in the stakeholder relations, or we cannot meet these objectives whatsoever. But the decision to define a situation as a crisis or not should be with the sponsor. Okay, so the sponsor assigns the project, and the sponsor has the formal authority, of course, to say, okay, no, we cannot continue to work like this, but we need to define a crisis. In many situations, but there might be situations like now in the Corona situation, for example, where even line manager, steering committees, profit center managers actually would intervene and would be the decision makers and would actually be in the position to overrule also the project sponsor. So I guess it depends a little bit on the project type and the situation, but given these differences, it might be either the sponsor or the line management. But what I said before, the sponsor in any case needs to be more operative involved than before, and the project manager is not in a position to formally decide that a project crisis needs to be defined, because the project manager might even be exchanged during the crisis resolution.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's important idea that I want to stress attention on it for maybe all of our guests, that in the beginning of your keynote, you showed us the list of criteria for crisis, and I thought about the difference between crisis and maybe problem that could maybe temporarily affect the project. And usually we expect that project managers should report the problems, but sometimes project managers, they're thinking that, okay, I'll handle it, we will be fine, and don't report. Are there any situations when employees don't report that crisis because they're thinking that it's just temporary problem, and then it becomes too late to identify crisis?
Temporary or not, I mean, it's not popular to report that there is a crisis or that there are major problems that require a heavy intervention. So I think it's very hard to expect from the project manager to be open enough in these situations. But basically, as you said, this is a part of the culture, how open you communicate, which kind of measures you have, and that you really understand the difference between minor changes or major changes. Okay, there's change management in projects, of course. You have change requests, you have changes in the scope, you have changes in the duration, but this is due to the characteristics of projects. They are dynamic, they are socially complex, which means this is why we do project controlling. Nobody can expect that you perform a project according to the original plans that you developed a year ago. That's ridiculous. This is no meaningful understanding of what project management is all about. So you have the dynamics in a project and you need to deal with this. But this is not crisis management, okay? This is minor changes, this is change requests. You adapt, you control, you report to the sponsor, you report to the steering committee, and they need to understand, they need to accept, to provide additional budgets whatsoever. But the crisis means that you radically change. It's a discontinuous development. You have continuous development, you have minor changes, and you have major changes. And these are the major changes. And we need to make this difference because they require very different approaches in dealing with these situations.
That's true. And to sum up with all these questions, we have a question from Marat Mazouni from Morocco, one of our guests, and he's asking that if we have a strong risk management system, can we can it help us to go through crisis smoothly? So does risk management system helps here?
Yes, of course. This is what I said before, that I was focusing on the resolution of the crisis, which means independent of risk management, you ran into a crisis and now you need to resolve. And in order to do this, you need a clear definition, you need a clear strategy, and so on. But what risk management teaches you is that you create an awareness, you analyze which risks might you run into. And if several risks together occur in a certain situation, then you might come into a crisis. And you might do in your risk management approach, as I said before, some scenario planning, okay? And define possible scenarios, best case, worst case of your project, for example. And for these different best and worst cases, you can come up with some provisions, how to prepare with alternative project plans, for example. If something is not working out, what do I do then? So this would be provision for a crisis situation. So yes, if you have a good risk management approach in place, this can help you to avoid crisis and to provide for crisis. But it's not helping you in resolving the crisis, because even if you do scenario planning, you will probably not consider all the possibilities that there are, and once of a sudden they hit you, and then you have to deal with the situation. And this is what I'm trying to say, that you need, if this is happening, have the guts, the courage to say, okay, sorry, but now we're in a crisis situation, and now we need to redesign the whole thing, or we need to stop the project. And from a company point of view, that might be the wisest and the smartest decision that you can make. Yeah,
that's true. Roland, thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us. Thank you for sharing this experience and this story. I'm sure that it's really valuable for all of our guests. I really hope to see you again on our next event, and wishing you good luck with your conference.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So, dear guests, we're finishing here and moving forward. So hope you still remember how to leave this room and join the next one. So the button is on the bottom. So see you in the next room.